Schubert's Serenade is one of those instantly recognisable pieces, and I remember learning it with my very first piano teacher all those years ago. However, I was once listening to Vladimir Horowitz play it, and suddenly he started playing something that was much more intricate, and I later discovered that in fact it was a transcription of the same piece by Liszt. So today I'd like to take you through how I went about practicing this amazingly beautiful transcription. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. As always, we'll use my 4-step process of discover, divide, conquer and integrate. And for the discovery step, some of the great recordings you'll find are of course Horowitz, but there's also Katia Buniatisvili, there's Marc, André, Hamelin. There are many others to choose from on YouTube. And of course, have a couple of nice slow playthroughs so you get a feel for it under your fingers. For practice purposes, I have split this piece into 3 main sections, with a 4th that covers the ending alone. I find it helpful to separate the ending out as its own section so that we consciously devote some time to it early on in the process. We basically have the main theme repeated 3 times. Once in a similar way to that in which we find it in most other transcriptions. A second time in the tenor, or as Liszt recommends, cello. And then a third time where we need to play both the melody and an echo of it in the right hand. So let's dive into the first section in detail. However, before we jump into practicing it, let's have a little think about the structure. We basically have a melody, a bass, and a chordal accompaniment. The accompaniment is interesting in a couple of ways. First, it's marked as always staccato and pianissimo. Yet we also have been told to use the pedal on each measure. Now this might sound counterintuitive. However, when the pedal is down, we get a somewhat different sound if we're using a staccato touch as opposed to a deeper touch into the keys. Secondly, Liszt splits these chords between the staves and therefore ostensibly between the hands. However, on watching Katia Buniatisvili play this, she takes the chords exclusively in her left hand. I've discussed previously that we don't always need to follow the notation as to how we divide things between the hands, and we may well find a different distribution works better for us. After some experimentation, I decided to take the chords with my left hand rather than split them. You might prefer to split them. In any event, the same practice techniques will work whatever you choose to do. The melody is also interesting as it has a 3/2 polyrhythm. So of course we need to ensure that we don't end up playing it as 2 16th notes followed by an 8th note. I divided this first section into 4 segments. The first being the introduction, and the last being a sort of bridge into the next section. The first segment is fairly straightforward, however, we might first want to practice it without pedal to ensure we're using a really staccato touch. The next 2 segments are more involved, so let's look at each of these in detail. I would initially further divide this segment into snippets of 2 measures. We'll use these snippets as our practice starting point to decide on fingering, etc. Now, the most helpful practice technique I found here was to use a hybrid between simplifying one of the hands and the add-on technique. So basically, as we start to work on this, we'll play the bass notes, all of the melody notes, but we'll progressively add the chords in the left hand. So initially, we'll play only the first 2 chords. First, look at each snippet individually to ensure we fully understood it. If taking the chords all in one hand, then you might find that the second measure of the first snippet lends itself to using the thumb on both the D and the E naturals. If we look at the first measure of the second snippet, we can see that the distribution of the accompanying chords isn't uniform as it was earlier. This might mean that we would not want them to simply sound like repeating chords. As soon as we've made these type of decisions, however, I recommend that we immediately move to practicing the entire segment using this initial simplified variant. The aim is to get to the point that we can easily play the entire segment without hesitation, yet of course we still have plenty of time to think as we've removed lots of the notes. Once we reach this point, let's add in the next chord. Again, look at each snippet individually and see how you feel about the fingering still. Some of these chord inversions can be a little stretchy, so you might prefer to jump rather than pivot on them. Now let's start practicing using this second variant. Again, the aim is to ensure that it feels easy. Once this is the case, we can then add in the next chord. If you've decided to distribute between the hands, pay particular attention now, as this is where Liszt introduces a somewhat different distribution in a couple of places. Again, after a quick check snippet by snippet that everything is working as needed, we can start to practice the entire segment with this third variant. Once we're fully happy with this, we can then add in that final chord and we'll be able to start practicing the entire segment as written. However, always start with a check snippet by snippet. You might, for example, find it helpful to play the final chord with a slightly different fingering to the others. Take a look at the third snippet, for example. I find it nice to close the hand rather than leaving it open. You might find that this entire process takes a number of practice sessions. Just how many probably depends on how long you have to devote to this piece each day. If you immediately find something easy, then simply move on to the next step. However, I did find that often I'd hesitate over which inversion of the chord I should be using, and given there is often a left-hand jump, it's not always easy to keep our eyes on the score. Now let's look at the third segment. We can in fact use exactly the same practice techniques that we've just used on the first segment, that of progressively adding left-hand chords. However, pay close attention to the score and you'll see there are a couple of places where Liszt varies the accompaniment pattern, specifically against the D minor and then the D major chords highlighted here. So as we start adding in these left-hand chords, let's be careful to take note of where this happens. The other element here is the grace notes. Ornaments I find are always a tricky thing, as there appear to be many different viewpoints on how they should be played. Given this, I feel that we should just consciously decide what we're going to do and do it. I opted to play them before the beat rather than on the beat. So again, initially, look at this snippet by snippet to settle on a fingering. Also, whilst we're at the snippet level, let's ensure we properly understand the score. Take a look, for example, at the third snippet. Notice that the upward pointing stems are against the lower note of the thirds rather than the upper one. This would seem to point to the fact that Liszt wants these brought out. We have something similar in the sixth snippet. This is one of the reasons why I initially used such small building blocks, so that we can focus on all these tiny details. You might well find, however, that certain snippets take more work than others, and so it pays to practice them for longer individually. The sixth snippet, for example, I found quite hard to play confidently. However, as we did with the second segment, we want to get to the point where we can practice the entire segment using our different simplified versions. So first with just two of the left-hand chords, then with three of them, then with four, and finally with all 5. In the 4th segment, we can see that Liszt has moved all of the notes in the chords to be notated in the bass clef and therefore the left hand. Note also that he has changed the bass, in fact from the end of the previous segment, from a dotted half note to an 8th note. This to me seems to indicate a change in pedalling. Sure, we pedal each measure, but we might change pedal mid-measure to avoid too much dissonance. We can again use our same practice technique here of progressively adding the left-hand chords. I also found it helpful to move to a closed position on some of the last chords. Once you're happy with all 4 segments as written, start adding them together. Work either forwards or backwards, combining the first 2 segments, then 3, and then finally all 4. Now for section 2. Given we don't have the introduction, this nicely splits into 3 segments. So starting with the first segment, note that Liszt again reminds us to make the melody expressive, as he did at the start of the first section. He also says it should be cello-like. Here we have a new challenge, that of playing a melody inside the accompaniment. As we look at each snippet, we'll need to decide whether we want to put the left hand over or under the right. You'll see what I've opted for, however you might find a different solution works better for your hands. Let's stick with the approach we used for the first section. We'll initially start with only the first 2 chords of the accompaniment. Again, starting snippet by snippet, pay attention that the melody really sings and doesn't get overpowered by an accompaniment note just above it, as you have in the first snippet here. Pay attention also to the intervals. So in the second snippet, we have an interval of a 6th followed by a 3rd, whereas in the 5th, it's an interval of a 3rd followed by a 6th. Note that in the 4th snippet, we don't need to cross the hands, but we'll need to move the right hand out of the way as the left hand is going to use the same notes. Again, once we've done this detailed examination and problem solving, we can start practicing the entire segment with this first variant. Then we can add in the next chord. Again, work snippet by snippet at first. Notice, for example, in the first snippet there is now a 3rd in the left hand, add in the note that was earlier used for the melody by the right. Then we can practice the entire segment in this variant. We can then add in the 4th chord and finally the 5th. The second segment we can work on in exactly the same way. Again, initially examine each snippet and work on it individually. Decide where the hands need to cross and where they don't. Carefully examine the left-hand chord patterns, as these occasionally vary to take the melody note into consideration, given that it's sometimes inside the chord, sometimes above and sometimes below it. To give you an idea, here are just the first few measures of this segment using each variant. The third segment here introduces an interesting technical challenge, namely the 2-note chords in G minor and then G major. Fingering and hand shifts are important to work out here, and I actually asked on one of my usual Facebook groups what might be the best fingering to use. A couple of different answers came back, which generally aligned with what I was thinking. However, somebody very kindly posted a video with a suggestion of how to go about actually executing that fingering. And the suggestion was actually very much like the double rotation you'll hear spoken about by anybody teaching the Taubman approach. The basic idea is that we use one of our fingers as a sort of pivot. So whilst the pattern is ascending, we release the upper note whilst holding the lower one, we rotate back towards the thumb, and then rotate towards the fingers we wish to play. When coming down, we release the lower notes, rotating towards the higher one before rotating the other directions to play the next notes. And I decided to work on it in this manner. In a case like this, then it's worth spending a good amount of time uniquely on the problem snippets. You might wish to do this hand separately, however, I opted to play the bass and the first two chords as I've done elsewhere in this piece initially. I just work on the G minor version first to ensure we get used to the motion, and then only later work on the G major version. Note in the G major, a change of fingering from 3 to 4 as we reverse direction at the top was recommended, and it does seem to work better. As you start to feel those right hand chords coming under control, move to practicing the entire segment as we did earlier by progressively adding left hand chords. As always, think about integrating these segments into an entire section. Don't do this until you feel good with each individual one. So if you're happy with the first two but not the third, then integrate just the first two initially. This now brings us to the third section. And as you can see, Liszt has changed the musical design again by introducing an echo of the melody in the right hand. Notice also one tiny detail here. Liszt has modified part of the melody to use a 16th note rather than an 8th note as elsewhere in the piece. So let's look in detail at the first segment. In this circumstance, I decided to reverse my approach in that I decided to simplify the right hand rather than the left. So first I omitted the echo completely. However, I practiced, of course, using my final intended fingering, so using the thumb on the double dotted quarter notes. Again, start snippet by snippet to work out the details and then progress to practicing the entire segment. Next, I added back part of the echo. I initially added the first of the upper triplets in the first and third snippet and the entire echo in the second and fourth. I think this is helpful to practice landing the melody note with the thumb and ensuring it sings above the higher note that is played as part of the echo. Again, snippet by snippet at first, and then practicing the entire segment. Finally, I added the remainder of the echo in the first and the third snippets. We could work on the second segment in a similar manner. However, I'd be inclined to first practice it by equally simplifying the left hand to just the first two chords. However, we have an important decision to make in the first snippet here. If we look at the echo, we have an E natural right between a D natural and an A natural, and that's more than an octave below. We also have a D natural to be played against the F natural melody note. I think that for the D, we have no option but to redistribute and take the F with the left hand. However, for the E, either hand would be possible. I started by keeping the melody in the right hand here, but whilst working on the snippet, I found that it seemed overly awkward, so opted to redistribute that melody note into the left hand. Once this feels good, we can progressively start adding more of the echo. So first we can just add those parts that correspond with a melody note, again to ensure we get the voicing controlled. Again, snippet by snippet at first, before moving on to the entire segment. Pay particular attention to the sixth snippet. Note the tie between the grace note and the main note. This to me means we need to play the lower G separately, especially since it's part of the melody. We can then add back the remainder of the left hand. Then finally, the remainder of the echo. As each of these segments starts to feel comfortable, start to integrate them together. Now let's look at the third segment. I found the traditional add-on technique to be helpful for the first two snippets. So first, just the first beat, then add the second, then add the third, then the first beat of the following measure. Here, as opposed to elsewhere in the piece, I would keep working snippet by snippet somewhat longer, as this is the climax of the piece. Ensure that each of these snippets feels comfortable before trying to add both together. Then for the next two snippets, we can practice by progressively adding the left-hand chords. So we start with just the first 3/8 note chords. As each individual one comes under control, we can practice both together before adding the next chord. Our last two snippets are almost the same as the last two of the previous segment, so only the first element of this needs separate work. This then leaves us with the fourth section. The first challenge is the rolled chords. I'd work on these first, omitting the last three chords in the left hand. Notice that we need to slow down and get quieter here. We have a dolcissimo chromatic scale to think about. You may wish to do this with the traditional chromatic scale fingering. However, I opted to use a modified fingering as ultimately it will be easier to get faster with this version than with the traditional one. This can be practiced using rhythmic variants, trying to group the notes equally from top to bottom. It can also be worked on in two halves, from the G sharp to the G natural, and then from the G natural to the top. We can also mentally subdivide it into a set of triplets, finishing with a set of 4 notes. We also have the final arpeggiated figure to contend with. Notice that aside the first set of triplets, we always have a D in the left hand against an F sharp in the right, and an A in the left hand against an A in the right. For the right hand fingering, I found 4 on A and 2 on F sharp work well on the way up, with 3 and 5 on the way down. For the left hand fingering, I used 5 on the D going up and mostly 1 on the way back down. I'd advise experimenting for yourself. I'd work on this using add-on and also start practicing it very early on in the learning process to give it time to settle in. Now, you might actually choose to work on this by practicing several sections in parallel rather than mastering one and then moving on to the next. And given that we're going to use these simplified versions, then getting to a point where we can actually do that is relatively easy. And then, of course, another little trick is to get into the habit of practicing sections together. So practice sections 1 and 2 together, 2 and 3 together, 3 and 4 together. Again, this helps us get used to playing longer parts of the piece without being as daunted as having to get all the way from the beginning to the end in one go. So I hope these practice suggestions have inspired you to have a go at this piece. It's quite tricky to play, but I think it's well worth the effort. And then if you'd like to learn another transcription, here's a link to the tutorial on the melody by Gluck as transcribed by Scambati. If you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit that little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I do thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.